Retiring in your early 60s sounds fantastic, but with just £100,000, is it even possible? Well, in this video, we're going to break down a real case study to find out if it is. We're going to look at income streams, living costs, and the tough trade-offs that sometimes you have to make with a pot of this size if you want to retire a bit earlier. Now, as always, if you're thinking, is early retirement even possible for me? Well, we're here to help. Our free retirement review is designed to answer those questions and any others that you have. And there's no fee, there's no obligation, just clear, tailored advice based on your particular situation. Now, when you're ready, if you want, you can click the link in the description down below and you can book your free session. So folks, this is Jeff. Now, a friend had recommended our free review to him after going through the process and becoming a client, so he got himself booked in. He was 60 when he came to Reeves and he had a real burning desire to retire as soon as he could, but he was pretty realistic and thought, look, I know I can't retire now, but what about 62? And he had just £100,000 in total in his current pensions and savings at the time of seeking our advice. Now, he did know it was going to be a wee bit tight, but at least he was asking the right questions, and that's always a great start. So Jeff was honest. He didn't feel confident with money particularly. He had no idea how to manage his pensions for the best outcomes. He just knew what he wanted and that he was going to need some help. So at the time, Jeff was working as an IT administrator. He was on 24 grand a year. He was paying the usual 5% into his workplace pension, and his employer was contributing 3%. So this is just the basic standard auto enrollment rules. Now, over the years, he'd built up 5 historic pensions, and in total that was around 81 grand, and his current workplace pension had £14,000 in it. On top of that, he had a cash ISA, his emergency fund if you like, and that had 5 grand in it. So in total he had £100,000 at 60. Now, Jeff didn't own a home, he was renting, he was paying £950 a month, and obviously that's a hefty chunk of his monthly income. And his state pension, which is just short of 12k a year, was due at 67. So with just 2 years to go in his head, and he had modest savings, he had no property to fall back on, and rising costs of living as well, could Jeff actually afford to retire at 62, and what would it look like if he did? So as part of Jeff's review, we took time to understand his lifestyle, because retirement isn't just about the numbers, although they are obviously very important. Jeff had a partner, Dawn. Now, they weren't living together at this particular point in time, but they'd been going out. Was that the right term in this day and age? I'm not sure. They'd been going out for quite a long time, and they did spend most of their spare time together, mainly at Jeff's house. He was also a keen swimmer. He regularly caught up with mates at his local club, and beyond that, well, Jeff kept things pretty simple. So when we asked how much he thought he'd need, Jeff wasn't really sure at first. That's not at all unusual. After a bit of reflection and a bit of coaxing from us and having a look at a budget planner, he said he could comfortably manage £2,000 a month if that was from 62 to 75. And like many people, he expected to spend a bit less later in life, so we set his 75 plus income at £1,750. So that gave us a solid baseline to work from and run some numbers. Now, for the plan we put in place, we used a 2% inflation rate because that's in line with the government's long-term target, and we started off with a 3% investment return based on a cautious risk level. Just a quick bit of reflection about these growth rates that we've picked. Now, we've deliberately chosen these as a conservative estimate. We often get feedback in the comments from people saying that the assumptions we use in terms of how much your investment can grow by is awful, and quoting returns of 10% a year. To be crystal clear, we're completely aware of what's possible. I've been doing this for 40 years, especially when it comes to investing, and you should all appreciate that some years are in fact superb and other years are very poor. Now, when it comes to doing your own retirement forecasting, we're completely happy to use what history suggests is possible and base it on your understanding and expectations. But when we are stress testing, it's really important to under-egg the investment pudding, so people aren't planning their lives around something that might not actually happen. What if, for example, we had 5 awful years because everything in the whole of the world fell apart? We also need to think what is possible, both short-term and long-term, and your personal attitude and experience of investment risk. By risk, of course, we mean the degree of fluctuation in the value of your investments which you are prepared to tolerate in order to avoid sleepless nights, basically. So whilst some figures out there might suggest higher returns, we tend to take a more conservative approach generally with our assumptions, just to keep things grounded and realistic. realistic. But when you go through the review, we can explain all this and we'll use whatever figures you feel you're prepared to accept. Right, so Jeff knew his pot was limited and that there might be some tough decisions ahead for him, but he was ready to explore the options, and that's really good. The decisions were ultimately his, but the good news, well, he had more options than he thought. So let's break down those options. From the start, Jeff understood that with a relatively small pension pot, he might need to consider some different routes to retirement. The most important thing was that we were there to support and guide him every step of the way. Now, ultimately, the decision was his to make, and it was a good place to be knowing he had real choices ahead. So first things first, what did Jeff's plan look like before he sought advice? Well, I guess it's no surprise, really, it didn't look great. As you can see, if Jeff continued his current path, he was projected to run out of money by the age of 67. This would leave him only with 5 years to enjoy retirement before relying solely on the state pension of about £1,000 a month. Now, by 90, he faced a shortfall exceeding £179,000, and with a pension pot that grew to just £105,000 by the time he retired at 62, his plan honestly just didn't look very viable at all. Yes, it was pretty daunting for Jeff. We knew this. It wasn't the end of the story though, so we got to work. Now, we started by digging into Jeff's 5 old pension pots. The goal, well, to see if we could consolidate them into one clear, manageable pot. Why? Well, because keeping things in one place absolutely does make life easier, and it's often a wee bit cheaper. But consolidation isn't automatic. First, we needed to assess how those pensions were performing and check for any hidden fees that Jeff might have actually been paying unknowingly. We also need to check whether they had any hidden benefits that actually would really be disappointing if he gave up. Now, if it made sense financially and practically and Jeff was comfortable, then consolidation was firmly on the table, and he wanted that simplification, as in fact most people who come to us do. So what came next? Well, from the moment we consolidated Jeff's pensions, one thing stood out. They hadn't been actively managed to their full potential, and that's really common actually. Their historic performance was poor compared to the level of risk he'd been exposed to and what else he could have been invested in. This is really common, as I've said. It gives us a clear opportunity to improve outcomes. If we can squeeze another couple of % out of his funds compared to what he'd get if he stayed where he was, well, that'll obviously get him closer to his goals over the long term. But with just 2 years until retirement, we wanted to see how much of a difference small changes could actually make. Specifically, what if we nudged his investment risk up a wee bit? Now, Jeff's original plan assumed a 3% annual return, which we would assume to be a cautious approach. And remember what I've said earlier about what actually you can get in terms of returns. We're being conservative here. We also ran a 4% forecast to show the impact of different assumptions. This is illustrative only based on FCA rates. Higher returns may involve different risks and they don't guarantee better outcomes. This was to see the difference it might make. Now, it didn't transform the picture overnight, but it absolutely did help. His long-term deficit reduced by £2,000. It's not groundbreaking, sure, but this is exactly why we stress test, because when combined with other strategies, even small improvements can start to really add up. And this, well, it could absolutely form part of Jeff's final plan. To show the impact of small changes, we adjusted the forecast slightly again. What if Jeff's investments returned 5% instead of 3%? Now, whilst this represents a higher return assumption, it's still pretty conservative for a balanced risk investor, and it's important to note that the level of risk required to achieve this might vary depending on the individual investor's circumstances and, of course, their risk profile. But what was the result? Well, it was a clear improvement again. His projected shortfall dropped by £5,000. I mean, £5,000's £5,000, folks, at the end of the day. It's not life-changing in isolation, maybe, but that is exactly how small, smart adjustments, when layered together, begin to shift the big picture. Now, that said, it is important to remember that nothing's guaranteed, folks. Building your future on expected returns takes a fair amount of confidence and even more room for error if things don't go as planned. But next, we looked at what Jeff's plan might look like if he reduced his income requirements slightly. Now, to be clear, his expectations were already pretty modest, but also he was only on 24 grand a year now. So, you know, putting a forecast of 2 grand a month in retirement, pretty much he's saying I needed to stay the same. But just for the sake of exploring the possibilities, we wanted to see how much of a difference even a small adjustment would actually make. So what was the answer? Well, it was a big one actually. If he reduced his monthly outgoings from £2,000 a month to £1,750 a month, month until age 75. And then from 1750 to 1500 beyond that, well, his projected deficit dropped by over 65 grand. That's a serious improvement. Would Jeff actually choose this route? Why, maybe not. And that's totally fine, of course. This isn't about pushing plans that don't feel right, but it is about exploring and understanding your options and the trade-offs so you can make confident, well-informed decisions. Now, as with every scenario, we stress tested this thoroughly, and whilst Jeff might not take this path, seeing its impact was of course really valuable. So on the final plan we landed on, well, what did that look like? And it's definitely worth sticking around for the result. Next, we explored a simple yet transformative shift, cutting Jeff's rental costs. Now, he didn't own his own home, so selling wasn't an option and downsizing wasn't an option, and he was paying £950 a month just on rent. That's a significant monthly expense, and it weighed really heavily on his finances. Now, the turning point came when we looked at something that Jeff and his partner Dawn had already discussed: moving in together. This wasn't just a financial decision, of course, it was a life choice that required open communication and mutual understanding and trust. Of course it did. But by involving Dawn in the conversation about their budget and future, they could align their goals and make a plan that benefited them both. Obviously, sharing rent and sharing household bills meant more than just splitting the cost. It was a partnership that lightened the financial load for both of them. The impact? Massive. This one decision reduced Jeff's projected deficit from over 179 grand to just 56,000 pounds. It's a 123,000 pound improvement, and it highlights really how important it is to talk openly with your nearest and dearest about your financial goals and your challenges, especially when planning for retirement like Dawn. Now, whether it's a couple, close friends, or family members moving in together to share costs, combining resources can make a massive difference, and sometimes it's actually the most powerful change, and it'll come from the decisions you're actually ready to make together. So for more on how two becoming one can boost your financial future, you can check out our YouTube video on that particular topic. Now, finally, as we mentioned right at the start, Jeff always knew that retiring at 62 might be a stretch if he wanted a retirement he could really enjoy. So we ran the numbers to see what would happen if he pushed his retirement age back to 67. The result? Well, of course, it was a massive shift. His projected shortfall dropped by over 83 grand, and even better, instead of running out of money at 67, his funds would comfortably last him until 77. That's an extra 10 years of financial security. Now, was it the perfect solution on its own? Not quite, but it was a huge improvement, and combined with all the other changes, it brought Jeff much closer to a retirement that actually worked beautifully for him. And on that note, after taking some time to think things through and discussing everything with Dawn, Jeff came back to us with a really clear vision. As part of his initial review, he decided to increase his investment risk to balanced, which was about a 4% return forecast, but of course we're hoping to do better. He and Dawn also agreed to move in together. The time just felt right because they had a really good honest discussion about how it would matter financially, and that would ease a lot of the financial pressure from renting solo, of course. And finally, Jeff made peace with the idea of delaying his retirement, working a little longer, and aiming to fully retire at 67 instead of 72. It wasn't the plan he originally imagined, but it was one he felt confident in. Of course, that gives him lots of options and control as well, and most importantly, peace of mind. But I will say that if everything goes according to plan and that 4% turns into 6% or 8%, which we look at every year with Jeff and all of our clients, it might be that 67 could become 66, 65, 64, 63, and who knows, even 62. So let's take a bit of a step back. Jeff didn't have a huge pension pot. That's just the reality, and I'm sure there's lots of people out there in a similar situation. But what he did have was a really clear goal and the courage and intent to take action. He made the conscious decision to seek advice, get that clarity, and take control of his future. Could he retire at 62? Well, maybe, but in reality, it'll be tough, and he might not get the retirement he really wants unless he really saved hard in the meantime and managed to get a couple of years excellent investment returns, and that those continue above the percentages that we stress test at. It's possible, of course, and something we review every year with our clients, but with a few smart moves, adjusting his timeline, tweaking his investment strategy, making great lifestyle decisions that worked for Jeff and Dawn, well, retirement wasn't far off at all. More importantly, it meant his money could continue to grow and support the life he wanted. And the best part, he now understands what is possible and realistic, and his stress levels are right under control. It's a really powerful message, folks, and remember, you don't have to do this alone. To help you make the best choice for your retirement, we've put together a must-watch video comparing annuities versus drawdown. It's a great educational piece revealing the key differences and what each could mean for your future income. Understanding this could be a game changer for your financial peace of mind, and actually lots of people just don't understand the difference between annuities and drawdown, and it's really important, so don't miss out. Click here to watch, and I'm going to see you there.